The Necklace and the Curse. In the small, forgotten town of Kings Hollow, nestled deep in the Appalachian Mountains, there was a legend that had haunted the town for generations. It was the tale of a cursed necklace. A necklace so powerful, so malevolent, that it could turn the most peaceful soul into something unrecognizable. The story began in the days when Kings Hollow was just a settlement, barely marked on any map. The town had been founded in the mid-1700s, settled by families who came seeking fortune in the dense forests and rich lands of the mountain range. Among these families was the Bell family, Hannah Bell, a woman with deep, dark eyes and a heart as full of mystery as the woods that surrounded them. Hannah was known to be a quiet woman, a seamstress who spun fine clothes from the wild fabrics of nature, woven wool, feathers, and even furs from the animals that roamed the woods. She had a deep connection with the land, or so the townsfolk believed. But there was one thing about Hannah that the people whispered about when she wasn't around: the necklace she always wore. It was a beautiful piece, a silver chain that was adorned with a stone the color of midnight. The stone, a large, black opal, shimmered with an eerie light, reflecting colors that couldn't possibly exist. Many believed it to be a gift from an old lover, a man who had disappeared long ago under mysterious circumstances, never to be seen again. Others thought the necklace had been passed down from her ancestors, an heirloom that carried with it the power of the Bell family's cursed bloodline. Hannah never spoke of the necklace, nor did she ever take it off. She wore it day and night, the cool stone nestled against her chest, just under the curve of her collarbone. But no one knew where it came from, or why it held such an unnatural pull on her. One fateful night, as a thick fog rolled down from the mountain passes, the town found itself on the brink of disaster. A sickness began to sweep through the town. People fell ill with fevers, rashes, and delirium. Crops failed, animals went missing, and the very earth beneath their feet seemed to tremble with an unsettling energy. The townspeople, desperate for answers, turned to Hannah Bell, for she was the one who seemed to understand the land better than anyone. They begged her to help them, to find a way to lift the curse they believed had befallen them. Hannah, however, was distant, her face pale, her eyes haunted by something that no one could see. "I cannot undo what has been done," she told them, her voice a soft whisper. "The curse that binds this town was born long before my time." But when the illness reached its peak and a handful of children lay on the brink of death, the people grew angry. They demanded that Hannah do something, that she find a way to end their suffering. Hannah knew what the townsfolk did not. The curse was not simply a force of nature, nor a bad stroke of luck. It was tied to the necklace she wore, a necklace given to her by a figure from her past, a figure who had vanished, leaving behind only a trail of darkness. That night, in the privacy of her cabin, Hannah finally spoke of the necklace's origins. She sat before her hearth, her fingers trembling as she grasped the chain in her hands. The necklace, she said, had been crafted by a man named Elias. He had been a traveler, an outsider, a man with strange eyes and darker intentions. He had come to Kings Hollow seeking something, a stone, a relic, something lost in the depths of time. Elias had given her the necklace, promising that it would bring her great power, that it would protect her and her family from harm. But she didn't understand what the stone was capable of until it was too late. Elias, who had vanished the day after giving it to her, had left behind a curse that tied Hannah to the necklace forever. "It's not just a necklace," Hannah whispered to the mirror, her reflection staring back at her with hollow eyes. "It's a chain that binds my soul. And now it's bound to the town as well." As the days passed, Hannah's fears grew. The sickness worsened, and the people of Kings Hollow began to change. They grew wild, their eyes bloodshot, their faces gaunt. They turned on one another, driven by madness and hunger, as if the curse was eating away at their sanity. On the 7th night after the sickness first appeared, as the wind howled through the trees and the rain battered against the windows, Hannah knew it was time. She had to destroy the necklace, but she was not sure how. The man who had given it to her was long gone, and there were no instructions, no way to reverse the curse. Her cabin had become a prison, the necklace pulling at her with an insatiable hunger, its opal gleaming more brightly every night. The darkness had already begun to take root inside her, seeping through her veins like poison. The people of Kings Hollow were no longer people at all. They were empty shells, possessed by the curse she had unwittingly allowed to grow. Hannah stood in the center of her cabin, the stone in her hand, its cold touch numbing her fingers. Her heart pounded in her chest as the whispers grew louder, filling her head. The voice of Elias. The voice of the curse. "You cannot escape it," the voice hissed. "You cannot destroy what is already inside you." With a trembling hand, she cast the necklace into the flames of her hearth, watching as the opal stone sparked and crackled, releasing a thick black smoke that filled the room. She screamed, falling to her knees as the fire surged and the shadows in the corners of the cabin seemed to writhe. But the necklace didn't burn. Instead, the shadows grew stronger and Hannah's vision blurred. The room seemed to twist, the walls stretching and collapsing around her, until she was no longer in her cabin, but in the dark, cavernous depths of the woods. She was no longer alone. There were figures moving in the trees, their eyes glowing like embers, watching her. And then, just as the shadows began to consume her, a voice came from the darkness. It was Elias. "You thought you could destroy it," he said, his voice cold and cruel. "But the curse is not so easily undone." Hannah screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the dark, and the necklace, still hanging around her neck, began to pulse as if alive, as if it had been waiting all along. The darkness closed in and King's Hollow fell silent. The curse awakens. The following morning, a thick fog clung to the ground, swallowing the town of King's Hollow in a gray haze. The houses, once quaint and inviting, now appeared like forgotten relics of an older world, shrouded in mystery and doom. The townspeople, who had once been lively and warm-hearted, moved about in silence, their eyes clouded with an eerie, unsettling emptiness. They knew something had changed, but they didn't know what. It was a day like any other in King's Hollow, but something hung heavy in the air, a sense of dread that refused to leave. And then, in the very heart of the town, something began to stir.
Maya Bell, Hannah's niece, had always felt like an outsider in King's Hollow. She had grown up hearing whispers about her aunt, the mysterious, quiet woman who had kept to herself after the tragedy that befell her family all those years ago. The stories of the cursed necklace had been passed down through generations, and Maya had always wondered if there was any truth to them. But now, as she stood in the doorway of her aunt's cabin, staring at the smoldering ashes of what had once been a fire, she knew, deep in her bones, that something terrible had happened. The necklace, which had been burned in the flames, was now gone. Or at least, that's what Maya thought. Her eyes flickered over the remnants of the fire. The charred remains of the necklace were nowhere to be seen. The hearth, once full of warmth and light, was now cold and empty, as though it had never been used. But the air around her felt thick, like something was still lingering, something that refused to let go. The stories had always painted a vivid picture of a curse tied to a piece of jewelry, but no one had ever spoken of what happened after the necklace was destroyed. They had only whispered that the curse would consume anyone who dared to seek it out. Maya didn't know whether to believe in the legends or dismiss them as superstition, but as the wind howled through the trees outside, she couldn't shake the feeling that her aunt had been right all along. And so, she began to search. Her first stop was the town square, where she had always heard the old folk gather to share their stories. There, she found the same weathered faces that had lived through the darkest times and seen things that most people never would. They were quiet now, but when Maya approached, she caught their eyes. The moment they saw her, their expressions darkened. "Looking for something, Maya?" Old Mrs. Harlan asked, her voice low, almost a whisper, as she rocked in her chair. Maya took a step closer. "I need to know what happened to my aunt," she said, her voice trembling. The old woman looked away, her gnarled fingers gripping the edges of her chair. "You don't want to know," she muttered, barely audible. But Maya pressed on. "What happened to the necklace?" The other villagers fell silent, exchanging nervous glances, as though the question itself had opened an old wound. "It wasn't just the necklace that was cursed," Mrs. Harlan finally said, her voice quivering. "It was the land, too. You see, the Bell family never should have come to King's Hollow. Not when they did." Maya frowned. "What do you mean?" "The Bell family was bound to the curse from the very beginning," Mrs. Harlan explained. "It's said that the curse was placed long before Hannah ever laid eyes on that necklace. A curse tied to something ancient, something buried beneath the earth itself." The hairs on the back of Maya's neck stood up. "What was buried beneath the earth?" Mrs. Harlan hesitated, glancing over her shoulder, as if she feared someone might be listening. "A dark spirit. A spirit who had been bound in the deep, forgotten caverns beneath the town. The necklace was the key, made of the very stone that kept the spirit locked away. Whoever wore it would slowly be consumed by it, just as Hannah was." Maya's heart raced. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, but the answers left her with even more questions. Why did she wear it? Why didn't she destroy it sooner? Mrs. Harlan's voice dropped to a whisper. Hannah didn't have a choice. Once the necklace was given to her, she was marked. That man, Elias, the one who gave it to her, he was more than just a man. He was the spirit servant, sent to find someone worthy enough to wear the necklace. He didn't leave her with a choice. She was bound to it, just like everyone else in King's Hollow. Maya felt her stomach twist. And what happened to the town? What happened to all of them? The old woman's eyes darkened. The curse didn't just stay with Hannah. It spread. Anyone who came into contact with that necklace, anyone who sought its power, was slowly consumed by it. The town of King's Hollow became a place where the past never left, a town where souls were trapped in time, never allowed to move on. Maya stood there in stunned silence, trying to process the horrors that Mrs. Harlan had just spoken. It was too much to take in. So what now? Maya whispered. What can we do? You can't undo what's been done, child, Mrs. Harlan said. The curse is too strong. It's already taken hold of the land, of the people. And when one curse is broken, another rises in its place. Maya felt her pulse quicken. The village around her seemed to press in, as though the walls were closing in on her. She turned quickly, suddenly feeling the urge to leave the square, to get away from the heavy air, the oppressive weight of history. As she made her way back to her aunt's cabin, her mind was racing, her thoughts a jumble of fear and confusion. She had to find out what happened to her aunt. She had to understand why the curse still lingered in King's Hollow, why it still haunted the town even after the necklace had been destroyed. When she reached the cabin, it was dark, the sun having long since dipped behind the mountains. The air had turned colder, and the wind outside howled like a pack of wolves. As she entered the cabin, she was greeted by an overwhelming stillness, the kind of silence that settles like a heavy blanket over everything. She made her way into the small room where her aunt had once kept her things, but when she reached the far corner, something stopped her. The necklace was there. Not burned to ashes. Not destroyed. It lay on the floor, gleaming in the faint moonlight that slipped through the cracks in the walls. Maya's heart skipped a beat. It shouldn't have been there. It should have been gone. But it was back. And this time, it wasn't just a necklace. It was the key to something darker than she could ever imagine. The awakening of the curse. Maya stood frozen in the doorway, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The necklace lay on the floor in front of her, almost gleaming in the moonlight that spilled through the cabin's thin windows. But this wasn't just any piece of jewelry. It was the source of everything that had gone wrong in King's Hollow. The sickness, the madness, the curse that had trapped this town in time for so many years. Her hands trembled as she stepped closer to the necklace, each footfall heavier than the last. The stone, the black opal, seemed to pulse in the silence, as if it were alive, watching her. Maya could almost hear it, a faint whisper just beyond the edge of her hearing, promises of power, of secrets long hidden, of a future written in shadows. But Maya wasn't foolish. She had learned enough from the townsfolk, from the fragments of her aunt's story, to understand what she was facing. She was standing at the edge of a precipice, and what lay ahead wasn't just a curse. It was a damnation that had followed the Bell family for generations. She couldn't pick it up. She knew she couldn't. Not without paying a price. Yet, the pull was undeniable. She reached out, her fingers brushing against the cold metal. The moment she touched the necklace, a shock of energy coursed through her, as though the necklace was reacting to her touch, recognizing her bloodline. Her vision blurred, and for a brief moment, the cabin around her seemed to warp and distort. The walls seemed to stretch, the floor groaning beneath her feet. The voices were back. Maya! The whisper was soft at first, like the rustle of dead leaves. But then it grew louder, more insistent, until it was no longer just a whisper. It was a chorus, echoing, reverberating, each voice dripping with malice and sorrow. Maya, you're ours now! The room began to spin, and Maya staggered back, clutching at her chest. She could feel it now, an energy building inside her, dark and suffocating, like a weight pressing on her very soul. The necklace wasn't just an object, it was a conduit, a gateway to something far worse than she could imagine. And now that she had touched it, she could feel the curse awakening, stirring like an ancient beast rising from slumber. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, the sensation faded. The room stilled. The voices fell silent. Maya's chest heaved as she gasped for breath, her mind racing. She could still hear them, feel them, the voices, now trapped in her head like insects buzzing in her ears. She had made a terrible mistake. She knew that now. The necklace wasn't a tool to be wielded, it was a prison. And the more she was exposed to it, the harder it would be to escape its grip. But it was too late. A cold, shadowy figure appeared at the door. Elias. The figure stepped into the cabin, his presence filling the room with an oppressive weight. His eyes glowed like embers in the darkness, flickering with a cold, malevolent fire. He was tall, his features sharp and angular, his clothes old-fashioned, as though he had stepped out of a forgotten time. "Did you think you could escape it, Maya?" His voice was like gravel, rough and deep. "Did you think you could break the curse by running from it?" Maya backed away, her legs shaking beneath her. What do you want from me?" Elias's lips twisted into a cruel smile. "What do I want?" "Oh, Maya, you already know the answer. You've been part of this curse since the moment you were born. The Bell family has always been bound to it, just as I have. We are tied to the land, to the necklace, to the power that was buried beneath these hills." Maya's pulse quickened. "But why me? Why my family?" He took a step forward, and the air seemed to grow colder with every movement. "Your family was chosen to be the caretakers of the curse. The necklace was forged long ago, made of the stone that binds the spirit beneath the earth. When your ancestor first laid claim to this land, they unknowingly bound themselves to something far darker than they could have imagined. And when Hannah Bell received the necklace, she became its keeper. She was bound to it. And so, too, was the town. But I didn't choose this," Maya cried out, her voice filled with desperation. "I didn't ask for this." Elias's eyes darkened. "None of you asked for it. But that doesn't matter. It's in your blood, Maya. It's in all of you. And now that you've touched the necklace, it's yours to carry. The curse will follow you. It will consume you, just as it did your aunt." Tears sprang to Maya's eyes as the weight of his words pressed down on her. She had known, deep down, that there was no escaping her family's legacy. But hearing the truth, seeing Elias here in front of her, made it all too real. She was trapped. The curse had been passed on to her, just as it had been passed to her aunt, and her ancestors before her. "Please, no," she whispered, her voice shaking. "I can't. You already have." Elias interrupted, his voice like ice. "And now you will pay the price. Your soul, your blood, it all belongs to the land, to the curse. You cannot run from it. You cannot hide from it." Maya turned away from him, panic flooding her chest. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. The walls of the cabin seemed to close in, pressing against her. The shadows grew longer, stretching toward her, pulling her into their grasp. But before Elias could reach her, something shifted. A light, faint and distant, flickered in the corner of the room. Maya turned toward it, and for the first time, she saw something that gave her hope, a vision of the past. It was her Aunt Hannah, standing before the hearth, her hand reaching out, her eyes wide with fear. The necklace glimmered around her neck, but there was something different about it. The necklace was glowing with a light that seemed to push back the darkness, pushing away the shadowy figure of Elias. Maya's heart raced. "Aunt Hannah," she whispered. And then, in the vision, Hannah spoke, her voice soft but strong. "Maya, you must do what I couldn't. You must break the chain. The land is cursed. But you can end it." Elias snarled, his face twisting in anger. "You can't listen to her. She failed. You'll fail too." But Maya wasn't listening to him anymore. The light from the vision of her aunt grew brighter, stronger, as though it was guiding her. With a sudden surge of strength, Maya grabbed the necklace from the floor, its cold metal burning in her hands. She closed her eyes and focused, the image of her aunt's face in her mind, the words echoing in her heart. She could feel the curse, the darkness that had consumed her family for generations, trying to pull her down. But she wouldn't let it. With a final, desperate cry, she hurled the necklace into the hearth. The flames roared to life, the light burning hotter, brighter, as though it were cleansing the very earth beneath her feet. For a long moment, everything was still. The air was thick with smoke, the darkness retreating. Elias's form began to fade, his voice a distant echo. But Maya was free. The curse was broken. The necklace was no more. And King's Hollow, finally, was free of its darkness.